What if the most famous witch hunt in American history was never about witches at all? In 1692, the small, devout Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, descended into a nightmare of paranoia and accusation. It began with a few teenage girls claiming to be tormented by invisible specters. It ended with 19 innocent people hanging on Gallows Hill. The story, we are taught, is one of religious fanaticism and superstitious fear, but this is only a shadow of the truth. The real story of the Salem Witch Trials is far more complex, more human, and infinitely more terrifying. It is a story of social anxiety, political rivalry, and personal vendettas, all masked by the righteous fury of a holy war. This is a psychological autopsy of a community that turned on itself. We will dissect the lies, the manipulations, and the real hidden motives that fueled the accusations. This is the story of how a group of teenage girls held a village in their thrall and turned a courtroom into a theater of death. This is the terrifying truth of the Salem trials. To understand the madness that consumed Salem, we must first understand the world that created it. The Massachusetts Bay Colony in the late 17th century was a society living on the edge of a knife. The settlers were surrounded by a vast, dark, and seemingly endless wilderness, which they believed to be the literal domain of the devil. They were in a constant state of conflict with the Native American tribes, a bloody and terrifying frontier war that bred a deep and pervasive paranoia. Their world was also one of profound religious extremism. The Puritans had come to America to build a perfect city on a hill, a society governed by God's law. But their faith was not a source of comfort, it was a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. They believed that every human soul was in a state of perpetual warfare, between God and Satan. Every misfortune, a failed crop, a sick child, a harsh winter was not a random event, but a potential sign of God's wrath or the devil's insidious influence. Into this crucible of fear and faith came the community of Salem Village. It was a small, poor, and deeply resentful farming community that lived in the shadow of the more prosperous and worldly Salem town. For years, a bitter internal conflict had been festering in the village. There were disputes over land, arguments over church leadership, and a deep social divide between the struggling farmers and the more affluent families, who had connections to the merchant class of Salem town. The village was a pressure cooker of neighborhood squabbles, personal rivalries, and multi-generational resentments. It was a community that was already at war with itself, long before the first accusations of witchcraft were ever uttered. The spark that would ignite this powder keg appeared in the winter of 1692, in the home of the village minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty Parris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit strange and terrifying behavior. They would contort their bodies into unnatural positions, make strange, choking sounds, and scream out in pain as if they were being pricked and bitten by invisible pins. When the local doctor could find no physical cause for their ailments, he offered the only diagnosis that his Puritan worldview would allow. The girls were under an evil hand. They were bewitched. The long, dark winter of paranoia and suspicion had begun, and these afflicted girls, once powerless children in a rigid and patriarchal society, were about to become the most powerful and most dangerous people in the entire colony. With the official diagnosis of bewitchment, the private terror in the Parris household became a public crisis. The small village of Salem was now convinced that Satan's agents were walking among them, and the hunt for the witches began. The magistrates and ministers, men of authority, descended upon the Parris home to interrogate the afflicted girls, who, they demanded, was tormenting them. Who was the specter, the invisible demon that was pinching them, pricking them, and forcing their bodies into these unholy contortions? At first, the girls were silent, but under the intense, relentless pressure of the adults, they finally began to speak. They named 3 people, and these first 3 accused were not random. They were a perfect reflection of the social prejudices and power dynamics of the Puritan world. They were not powerful men or respected matrons. They were the most vulnerable, marginalized, and defenseless women in the entire village. The first was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who was known for her foul temper and for muttering under her breath when she was denied charity. In the Puritan mind, which equated poverty with moral failing, she was already a suspicious character. The second was Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who had angered the community by trying to disinherit her own sons from a previous marriage and give the property to her new husband. She had challenged the patriarchal norms of inheritance, a defiant act that made her a social outcast. But it was the third accused, a woman named Tituba, who would become the central figure in the nightmare that was about to unfold. Tituba was an enslaved woman in the Paris household, likely of South American or Caribbean origin. She was a woman with no rights, no social standing, and a different skin color. In the rigid, xenophobic world of the Puritans, she was the ultimate other. She was the perfect scapegoat. Let us conduct a psychological autopsy on these first accusations. The choice of these three women was a masterstroke of social survival for the young accusers. By naming these powerless outcasts, the girls were not challenging the existing power structure, they were reinforcing it. They were accusing the very people that the community already suspected, disliked, or feared. It was a safe, and therefore believable, accusation. The three women were arrested and subjected to a brutal public interrogation by the magistrates. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne vehemently denied the charges, but their pleas of innocence were dismissed. But it was Tituba, the enslaved woman, who changed the course of the entire crisis. After days of relentless questioning, and likely physical coercion from her master, Reverend Paris, Tituba did something that would pour gasoline on the fire of Salem's paranoia. She confessed. And it was not a simple confession. It was a spectacular, detailed, and horrifying story. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of flying through the air on a broomstick, of a black dog that was the devil in disguise. And most terrifyingly of all, she claimed that she was not alone. She said there was a coven of witches in Salem village, and she began to name other women, weaving a fantastic and terrifying narrative of a vast, satanic conspiracy. From a psychological perspective, Tituba's confession was a desperate act of self-preservation. She was a powerless slave in a system that had already condemned her. She knew that to deny the charge was to be branded a liar and likely be hanged, but to confess, and to become a witness for the prosecution, offered her a path to survival. She gave the magistrates exactly what they wanted to hear, a confirmation of their deepest fears, complete with lurid, supernatural details. Tituba's confession was the spark that caused the powder keg to explode. The witch hunt was no longer about two afflicted girls and three outcast women. It was now a full-blown investigation into a vast, satanic army that was secretly plotting to overthrow the Christian world. The fear was no longer contained. It was about to become a flood, and the accusations were about to spread from the outcasts to the very heart of the Salem community. Tituba's confession opened the floodgates. Suddenly, the afflicted girls, led by the increasingly influential Abigail Williams, began to see specters everywhere. The invisible demons that had been tormenting them now took on the faces of their neighbors. And the accusations that followed were a chilling reflection of the deep social fault lines that ran through Salem village. The accused were no longer just the homeless and the outcasts. They now included members of the more prosperous and respected families, individuals who had been involved in the long-standing disputes within the community. There was Rebecca Nurse, a pious and elderly woman from a large and influential family that had been in bitter land disputes with the Putnam family, one of the most powerful in the village and closely allied with Reverend Paris. There was Giles Corey, an outspoken and stubborn farmer who had clashed with various members of the community over the years, and there was even George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem village who had been forced out of his position due to disagreements over his salary. Let us conduct a psychological autopsy on this new wave of accusations. The afflicted girls, now empowered by the attention and authority they wielded, were no longer just reacting. They were strategically targeting individuals who were disliked, envied, or seen as a threat to the established social order or to the ambitions of their allies, like the Putnam family. The accusations became a weapon in the ongoing social warfare within the village. Old grievances could now be settled under the guise of religious justice. The trials themselves were a grotesque parody of legal proceedings. The most damning evidence accepted by the court was spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls about visions and dreams in which the accused tormented them as spectral figures. This type of evidence was inherently unverifiable and impossible for the accused to refute. How could one prove that someone didn't appear as a ghostly figure in another person's dream? The accused were trapped in a terrifying catch-22. If they confessed, they were spared execution but branded as witches. If they maintained their innocence, they faced almost certain conviction based on the spectral evidence and the increasingly frenzied atmosphere of the courtroom. The magistrates, often swayed by the intense public pressure and their own deeply held beliefs in the reality of witchcraft, rarely questioned the girls' dramatic pronouncements. As the accusations spiraled, so did the paranoia. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families were torn apart, and the very fabric of the community began to unravel. Anyone who dared to question the validity of the accusations, or to defend the accused, risked being accused themselves. Fear became the dominant force in Salem, a suffocating blanket of suspicion that silenced dissent and fueled the ever-growing list of the condemned. The initial fear of an external, demonic threat had mutated into a far more terrifying reality. The fear of one's own community, of the very people one had lived alongside for years. The true terror of Salem was not the imagined presence of witches, but the very real and devastating power of human paranoia and the speed at which a society can descend into deadly, irrational madness. The year of 1692 became a year of blood in Salem. As the trials continued, fueled by the relentless accusations of the afflicted girls and the unwavering belief of the magistrates, innocent life after innocent life was condemned. 19 people, men and women, were found guilty of witchcraft and met their deaths by hanging on Gallows Hill. Refusals to confess, even in the face of death, were seen as further proof of their demonic pact. The case of Giles Corey stands as a particularly brutal example of the injustice. When he refused to enter a plea, the court ordered him to be pressed to death under heavy stones, a gruesome torture intended to force a confession. He died in agonizing silence, his final words reportedly being, "More wait. Let us conduct a final psychological autopsy on this horrific outcome." The Salem Witch Trials were a perfect storm of pre-existing social tensions, religious extremism, and the terrifying power of manipulation. The afflicted girls, whether genuinely suffering from some form of psychological distress or deliberately orchestrating the hysteria for attention and power, or a combination of both, became the catalysts for a tragedy that spiraled completely out of control. The adults in positions of authority, the ministers and the magistrates, failed in their duty to uphold justice and reason, blinded by their own deeply ingrained beliefs about the devil's influence and swayed by the dramatic performances in the courtroom. They allowed fear to override logic and accepted unverifiable spectral evidence as irrefutable truth. The trials became a stage for the acting out of personal vendettas and the settling of old scores, all under the sanctimonious guise of eradicating evil from their community. As the death toll mounted, however, doubts began to creep into the minds of some of the more rational members of the colony. Prominent figures started to speak out against the absurdity of the spectral evidence and the injustice of the proceedings. Gradually, the tide of public opinion began to turn. By late 1692, the governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, finally intervened, ordering a halt to the trials and establishing a special court to review the cases. Eventually, the verdicts of guilt were retracted, and apologies were issued to the families of the victims. In the years that followed, reparations were paid, and the memory of the Salem witch trials became a stark warning about the dangers of mass hysteria, religious fanaticism, and the abuse of power. The terrifying truth of the Salem trials is that it was never truly about witches. It was about the fragility of reason in the face of fear, the ease with which social anxieties can be weaponized, and the devastating consequences of allowing prejudice and suspicion to dictate justice. The true horror of Salem is not the imagined specters, but the very real darkness that lies within the human heart when a community loses its way. The legacy of Salem endures as a chilling reminder of the importance of critical thinking, due process, and the unwavering defense of individual rights against the tide of popular opinion. It stands as a testament to how easily a society, gripped by fear and suspicion, can descend into injustice and leave behind a stain on the pages of history. The anatomy of this dread lies not in the supernatural, but in the ultra-human capacity for cruelty and irrationality.